On almost every ALTA survey that we do here at Redefined Horizons, ALTA survey is a land title survey. On almost every ALTA survey, we are asked to add notes to the survey. So after we submit the preliminary survey for review, usually the lender or the land title company will come back and they will ask us to add some notes. Occasionally, the seller or the buyer, if we're working for sophisticated seller or buyer, their legal counsel will come back and ask us to add some notes. But usually it's the lender or the title company. And so that process is not always super clean. There's usually some back and forth between myself, the land surveyor, and whoever's asking for the note to be put on the survey. And the reason why is usually when someone's asking for me to add a note to my survey, they are trying to transfer risk to me. I mean, that's not always wrong or inappropriate, but it means that I, as a surveyor, have to be very careful. And I want to add the note if I can and make sure the transaction closes, but I also don't want to unnecessarily or unfairly expose myself and my company to liability. So there's some negotiating that has to go on there when that request to add a note comes in from the title company or the lender. And so I want to give you an example of how this happened on a recent survey that we did, an ALTA survey we did in the East Bay, because I think it illustrates what I'm going to expect as the land surveyor from you, the client, or from your title company or from your lender. If you ask me to add a note to the survey. So in this example, we were over in the East Bay area of California, and we were doing an ALTA survey of an apartment complex. It had over 20 buildings on it. It was a heavily urbanized site, and we sent in the initial survey. We do a good job on our surveys. I'm very proud of the surveys we do, the ALTA surveys we do. We sent in the ALTA survey, and it came back, and the lender asked for three things. So they wanted me to add a note that said I had mapped all the pertinent easements. Okay, and the pertinent easements are easements that are attached to the parcel. They wanted me to add a note that said there were no utilities under the buildings, existing buildings. And they wanted me to add a note that said the adjacent roads were being maintained by the local government agency. Okay, so I didn't add any of those notes. And I'm gonna explain why. We're gonna talk about why. To do that, I am going to walk you through 4 questions that you should ask before you request a surveyor add a note to an ALTA survey. Okay, so I'm gonna walk you through those 4 questions, and we're gonna talk about the examples I just gave you. And then I'm gonna walk the surveyor through 5 questions they should ask before they add a note to the ALTA survey. And then finally, to conclude, I'm going to give you a handful of suggestions. What do you do if the surveyor and the other parties in the transaction can't agree to add a note? What are some things that can help you maybe negotiate a solution? Okay, so before you request a note on an ALTA survey from a land surveyor, before you ask them to add a note, you want to ask yourself these 4 questions. Okay, so here's the first question I want you to ask. Am I being ridiculous? Okay, that's the first question. If you're being ridiculous, I'm probably not going to add the note, right? And I'm not saying that to be snarky or sarcastic or mean. So let's go back to the example I gave you about those apartments. They wanted me to add a note to my survey that said there were no utilities under the buildings, the apartment buildings. I told the client, I said, that's ridiculous. Of course there's utilities under the building. Like every single building out there has sewer pipes underneath it, has water pipes underneath it, has electrical conduit and cable TV, internet cables underneath it. Like, no, I can't add that note to the survey. It's a nonsensical note, right? So that's the first question. Are you being ridiculous? Second question is this actually a survey matter? In other words, is it a question that a land surveyor can answer? So go back to the example of the apartments. They wanted me to tell them, put a note on the survey that said that the adjacent roads were being maintained by the public agency. How am I going to know that as a surveyor? Like, I can tell you a road's there. I can tell you the public agency holds the right-of-way, but I don't know how that road's maintained or how that maintenance is funded, right? So in that particular case, I told the client, I said, I can't add that note. What I can say is the physical improvements that make up the road are in the public right-of-way. Like, I can say that if you want, but I'm not going to add a note that specifies who's maintaining the public road unless you give me a letter from the public agency that says it's responsible for the road maintenance. So that's the second question. Is it actually a survey matter? Third question is, you should ask before you request a note, is if I ask the surveyor to add this note to the ALTA survey, what do I need to provide them? Okay, so let's go back to the example of the apartments. They wanted me to add a note to the survey that said I had mapped all easements attached to the parcel. I got back to the client and I said, I'm happy to add this note, but in order to do that, I need a list of all the attached easements from the title company. I don't have a way to find those. What that really involves is going to run a title search on all of the adjoining parcels. And the title company got back and said, we're not going to give Landon that. And I had to tell the client, you're not getting your note unless you talk the title company into doing that. And the client went back to the title company and said, I really need this. So Landon can add his note. And the title company said, all right, fine, we'll do it, but you're going to pay us a lot of money to do it. And then the client went back to their lender and they dropped the requirement because nobody wanted to pay for it. Okay, the fourth question you need to ask is before you request a note that I add a note to an ALTA survey. The fourth question is, if I ask the surveyor to add this note, are they entitled to some additional compensation? Right? I don't have a problem adding notes to a survey if that's the right kind of note. But if that involves me taking on some extra liability or doing some additional work, in most cases, I'm going to expect to be compensated for that, right? Now, if I know ahead of time, before you get me under contract, that you're going to require the note, that's different. But if this is a requirement for a note that's come up after I've signed the contract, in other words, I didn't have a way to know what was going to happen when I gave you the price, then I may ask you for some extra money. And so you need to be prepared for that. All right, now what if you're the surveyor and somebody has asked you to add notes to your ALTA survey? What are the 5 questions you need to ask? Well, there's several of them that are the same. So you need to ask, is someone being ridiculous? If they're being ridiculous, don't add the note. You need to ask, is this really a survey matter? If it's not a survey matter, don't add the note. The third thing is you need to ask, if I add this note, do I need to get some other information from other parties in the transaction? For example, the title report or the title document that lists the attached easements. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need, right? If it's something that somebody else needs to provide you, ask for it. If it's something you can do on your own, you could do that, but ask to be paid for your time. The fourth thing the surveyor needs to ask is what additional work needs to be done before I add the note, right? Don't just add the note. Make sure that you're doing the work so that you can honestly put the note on the map. And then the last thing the surveyor wants to ask, and this may be one of the most important questions, is my professional liability insurance going to cover that note? So if you're practicing outside your area of expertise or the area that you're allowed to practice under by law, so for example, I'm going to use a silly example, but if they ask you as a land surveyor to say something about the quality of the building foundations and you are dumb enough to put that note on your survey, it's probably not going to be covered by your professional liability insurance because you're practicing outside the scope of your license, right? That's an engineering question, not a surveying question. All right, so what if you, the client, go through my list of questions and request the note from the surveyor, and the surveyor goes through my list of questions and comes back and says, I can't add the note you want. What do you do at that point? All right, well, there's still some things you can do. You don't have to give up yet. Okay, so here's some things you can do if you and the surveyor don't agree on the note that needs to be added. First thing you want to do is figure out who wants the note. Is it the bank? Is it the title company? Is it the buyer? Is it the seller? Is it somebody else? So who wants the note? Ask that question. Second thing is find out, why do they want the note? What are they really concerned about, right? Ask yourself what risk is being transferred and to whom. Normally, if we're putting a note on the ALTA survey, somebody involved in the transaction wants to transfer the risk to the surveyor. I'm not saying that can't be done or that it's never okay to do that, but what I'm saying is you got to make sure it's the right kind of risk. You got to make sure that the surveyor understands that risk, and you got to make sure that they're being compensated for that risk or that they have an opportunity to mitigate it. And then you have to ask yourself, is a note on an ALTA survey the proper way to mitigate this risk? So let's go back to that silly example I gave you a couple minutes ago. You know, having the surveyor add a note about the quality of the building foundations is not the proper way to mitigate the risk of a foundation failure, right? The proper way to mitigate that risk is to hire a structural engineer or a civil engineer, have them inspect the building foundations, and then recommend repairs if needed, right? That's the proper way to mitigate the risk. It's not having your dumb surveyor put a note on his ALTA survey. That's not the proper way to do that. And then finally, the last thing is you can ask, is there something that can be done outside of the survey that will satisfy this mitigation of risk or transfer of risk? So you have to remember that there is a limit to what I can put on a land title survey. There is a specification I have to follow. The folks that write that specification are very picky about what kind of stuff I put on the map. But it may be that you can get some kind of report or guarantee from the title company or something outside of the ALTA survey that may satisfy whoever's trying to mitigate or transfer the risk. And finally, the last thing you can do is you can suggest alternative language. And that's probably the thing I do the most often that allows us to come to an agreement with the lender or the title company or the client about a note. So they'll ask me for some ridiculous note, and I will come back and say, hey, I can't put that note on the survey. Here's why. Here's some alternative language that I could potentially put on the survey. And oftentimes that alternative language is accepted and we're able to close the transaction. And a good surveyor will do that. So if you go back to the example of the apartments, they came to me and they said, hey, we want a note that says there's no utilities under the buildings. I said, that's ridiculous. There are utilities under the buildings. And I said, hey, what are you guys really worried about? And they said, well, what we're really worried about is like off-site utilities that traverse the parcel and run under a building. I said, I tell you what. I said, here's what I can do. I can tell you that during my field survey, I didn't observe any evidence of major utilities from off-site running across the parcel and through the buildings. I said, now that's just based on what I observed during the field survey. All right, it wasn't the result of pulling record drawings for utilities or doing a utility mark and locate, but I'm willing to say that, you know, when I was out doing the survey, I didn't see a canal or a pipeline going through the parcel. And they said, that's all we need. Let's go with that note. We were able to put that note on. I took on some risk there, but I was comfortable taking it on, and the client felt like they'd gotten the reassurance they needed. In this case, it was the lender, and we were able to close the transaction. So, ask yourself that list of questions before you request an additional note on an ALTA survey. Be prepared to pay a little bit of money if there's some extra risk or work that needs to be done by your surveyor to add that note. And remember, don't be ridiculous. If you're ridiculous, I'm going to tell you no.